So I want to explain why the Greens are pushing so hard to phase out negative gearing and the capital gains tax discount, which you've heard me say before are the big tax handouts to property investors, turbocharging house prices and denying millions of renters the chance to buy a home. So firstly, what is negative gearing? That's basically where a property investor purchases an investment property and then they actually end up making a loss on that investment and they can write that loss off on their entire tax. In other words, that's where they're spending more on the property than they're making in rental income. That includes, by the way, mortgage interest payments. So the federal government is actually helping property investors pay off their mortgages. That's not something that owner-occupiers get on their mortgages. The federal government doesn't give them help, but they do help property investors. The second tax handout is the capital gains tax discount. And that was introduced by John Howard in the year 2000. And that's where, say, a property investor sells a home and makes a $500,000 profit. Well, 50% of that profit, they get entirely tax-free. Now, a nurse who might say earn $90,000 a year, they don't get 50% of their income tax-free, but a property investor does. In combination, they have made property an incredibly lucrative financial asset for property investors. And since John Howard introduced the capital gains tax discount, we've seen an explosion in property investors entering the market. So back in the 1990s, 14% of all lending from banks to people to buy property was to investors. That has more than doubled now to 32% of all bank lending for people to buy houses now going to property investors. In other words, in general terms, there's been an almost doubling of the number of property investors purchasing properties via banks. What that has done is drive up the demand for housing and as a result, push out first home buyers and drive up house prices. And you can see that here. Since the introduction of the capital gains tax discount, you can see the orange line, which is house prices, versus the blue line, which is average disposable income. Well, property prices have surged ahead of income. And as a result, it's put home ownership out of reach for millions of Australians. And that's as a result of those tax handouts. To put it another way, prior to the introduction of the capital gains tax discount, the average house cost about 9 times the average disposable income. After the introduction of the capital gains tax discount, the average house is now over 16 times the average disposable income. What's worse is over the next 10 years, the total cost of these two tax handouts to the federal budget, in other words, money going to property investors, will be $176 billion. On average, $17 billion a year. That is 10 times more than the federal government spends every year on giving money to the states and territories for building public housing and homelessness services. So 10 times more money going to property investors than going towards public housing and homelessness support. It's even worse though, because the vast majority of those tax handouts go to the super wealthy. You can see here, this graph shows where the benefit of those tax handouts are going. And overwhelmingly, they're going to the top 10% of income earners. So to summarize up until this point, these are two big tax handouts that put money in the pocket of property investors that allow them to outbid and outcompete first home buyers and drive up the price of housing and break our housing system. That's why we're pushing so hard to phase out negative gearing and the capital gains tax discount. Now, of course, there are some who really don't want these tax handouts to go. For instance, people with 100 investment properties. Who can say why they don't want them to go? And they raise some completely nonsense objections. For instance, number one, they say, well, if you get rid of these tax handouts, then we'll stop supplying new housing. Except that property investors, by and large, don't supply new housing. They, in fact, hoard homes. Firstly, they say, oh, we'll sell them, and that will be less homes on the market. Except when a property investor sells a home, it doesn't disappear or spontaneously combust. Either another property investor buys it and it stays on the rental market, or an owner-occupier buys it, and that may end up meaning one less renter in the rental market because now they're a homeowner. The other thing they say is, well, we build new housing. Also not really true. Did you know that basically only 14% of investor purchases of homes are constructing new dwellings? That means the other 86% of all investor purchases of property are just driving up the price of existing dwellings and land because they're just hoarding homes that have already been built. The second objection you hear is, well, if we phase out negative gearing, then that will somehow push up rents. Except the one time where Labor briefly phased out negative gearing in the 1980s, well, rents actually in Brisbane, Melbourne and Adelaide went down. So basically, phasing out negative gearing and the capital gains tax discount are crucial to fixing this housing crisis. But don't take my word for it. For instance, this is what economist Saul Eslake said about negative gearing and CGT. It's actually quite difficult to think of anything that would do more to improve the affordability conditions for would-be home buyers than the abolition of negative gearing. Or what about Hal Pawson, a housing academic? Well, he said negative gearing and the capital gains tax discount, depress home ownership by pumping up house prices and thereby making house purchases unaffordable for marginal buyers. They exacerbate wealth inequality by accruing disproportionately to the already wealthy. One modelling of even weak changes to negative gearing and the capital gains tax discount found that there would be a 4.7% increase in home ownership. Now that doesn't sound that much, but actually what that could represent is roughly 500,000 new homeowners that previously were renters. Look, we are going to do everything we can to push Labor into phasing out negative gearing and the capital gains tax discount, because if we do, it could fundamentally change the lives of millions of Australians across the country right now who have given up hope on ever being able to buy a home.
Authorised by J. McCall, Australian Greens, Canberra.